Alright, everyone. Hello and welcome to this stream. So, this is my 3D analysis. I'm still new to this VR stuff, and I have no idea how to read your comments because, as you can see, no matter what direction I look in, I'll not be seeing your comments. So, I'll just be focusing on the analysis, and then when time comes, I'll take a look once every few minutes whenever I finish an analysis, see what you guys have to say, and then go on to the next one. But starting out, I have to hear from you guys. Is the sound okay? Is the visuals okay? Do you see everything? How is it like? So on. So, hello everyone, and let's see what you say about the sound and everything else. Avdivka wasn't Avdivka supposed to fall like a month or two ago? Well, who said that? I don't remember me saying that. Considering, like, I'm putting it into perspective of Bakhmut, and yeah, Bakhmut is quite, yeah, it was a long one. Alright, everyone says it's good. I'll go on with, I'll give you guys like a showcase as to how I see it and so on, and then you guys let me know how you think, and then we may just go straight to the analysis. Alright, let's get started. Alright. Starting out, we take a look at, let's start out with Avdivka, since that is our current focus. So when I click on this button here, it becomes truly 3D. Then I just keep zooming in until I get close enough. And there we go. This should be good enough. This right here, this is still under Ukrainian control. This is the military base which the Ukrainians have. Look at how close I can get to it. This is like, we can see here, I'm not sure if you can see it well, but this is a trench. It goes through. These are the trenches. This is a wedge. This is an area they've dug it out. It's a dugout where Ukrainian vehicles can drive from this area right here. Can you guys see my pointer? So this area right here, and through that all the way to the trenches, they can drive through that without being seen from afar due to the dugout. You can see here, this is the perspective. You cannot see what passes through. Then the trench just keeps going all the way down here. And then we see that there's actually a couple of hills, rocks, whichever it is. But yeah, you can see how the trench keeps going all the way over here. So the current zone of control is actually down here by the road. That is Russian control. I would advise everyone to open up my map or another map with a DPA, Syriac maps, whichever, that is accurate, and then just take a look at that so you can see who controls what, because unfortunately I cannot see that on the Google Earth map. I'll see in the future if I can do that, but so far it's not possible. We have right here, we have Opitne and we have Vodiane. So the fighting right now by Severne. This is Severne. Right here. Oh, I need to turn off the volume of my phone. Give me a second. Then I'll look at you guys' comments as well. More slower, it's quite disturbing. Like how I move or what else? Can you change the movement blur thing? Does it blur when I move? And thank you very much for daily updates. Cool. Didn't think you would be here. Wow, we an astronaut. Can you move slowly, please? You should do more collabs with his religions are in Denmark. Everything's fine. Those trenches go to the middle of the earth. Please move slower. It's quite disturbing. Cool. See. Okay. All right. Let's go slowly, and then we'll just take our time with this. All right, if you guys have opened up the map, you can see right here, this area is one of the trenches. this is the best quality you're going to get of the satellite images. So as you can see, what is happening to the point? Okay, as you can see right here, you can see that it goes all the way from over here. That is protecting its flank. There's a couple of dugouts for the tanks. Honestly, this is crazy how good of an imagery this is to actually see what is going on. So if we take a, how do I turn around? Let's see if I can turn around. This is zoom, maybe, nope. This is just me going away from it. I'm still learning how to use the VR Google Earth. Oh yeah, it was maybe this one? Nope, definitely not that. Okay, how do I... There we go, okay. Drag, okay, there we go, okay. There we go. Alright, wait. We actually shouldn't be looking at this because this is already beyond the front line. Let's go to Severne. So this is Severne. Going closer. So we see this is the western outskirts of the village. There is this forest line. If we take a look like this. This is the forest line towards Severne. My controllers are... Okay. I need to set this up properly for next time because they are very weird. We can see the first line here. If we go from afar, the forest lines here are all at a higher elevation than the field themselves. The reason for this is because when the farmers do the fields, they have to grow stuff, they have to dig down, and so on, while the tree lines are just left untouched. So there's this slight elevation. On top of that, there's the height of the trees, so it makes it difficult to look through the tree areas. So we see that there are multiple tree lines in this whole area. If we take a bit of a zoom out, we can see there's the tree line right here in the center. If my pointer stops teleporting everywhere. Then there's this tree line right here. Tree line right here, and so on. So the Russian control right now is underneath that. Can I use my mouse at all? Nope. This is not an option, unfortunately. Okay. I need to figure out how to make it easier for me to use the pointers without them flipping everyone off. Okay, let's try this. We're figuring out these things together so that... Okay. Doesn't look like it's teleporting that much anymore. Okay. So as we can see, there are these multiple tree lines. To get through these tree lines, the Russian forces will face a lot of issues. The reason for that is we have this wider one here south of Tonenka, and the Ukrainian forces have multiple fortifications in the area, and likely also ahead of the forest lines. To have the forest line in the back of the fortifications so that they can resupply, reorganize, while the areas in front will likely have dugout trenches similar to the Robotyne area. Unfortunately, we cannot look at the satellite images there. As for Severne itself, we also see that it is similar to this forest line here. There's a shorter one here, and then a wider one here to the south. This is the one that the Russian forces have broken through, and they've managed to gain positions here right ahead of it. This means that they have caught the last line before the Battle of Severny itself begins. The next step will be the Battle of Severny. So with this, we actually see that the Russian forces will likely try to gain control over this area right here, this square right here. The reason for this is if we take a look by zooming in, if my second remote starts working, there we go. So now we zoom in, and if we take a look very closely, if you look in this direction here, we can see that the area continues from where the Russians are. They have control over this area right here. Taking a look in the direction of Avdiivka, we have to zoom a bit out because this is... We can see that this area right here, let's go over to it. This is the citadel area. This area here, the Ukrainian forces have the high ground with these taller buildings. These are all high-rise buildings compared to the rest of Avdiivka. This area right here oversees all of Avdiivka, but also all of the fields to the south and to the west of it. So we can see down here Opitne, further ahead Vodiane, and in this direction, the direction of Severna right there, this is the position the Russians have. So going closer and back to the positions the Russians have, we can see that this area here is overlooked by the Ukrainian positions in the citadel area of the city of Avdiivka. Comparing that to the direction of Severna, we can see that there is this area here, which is... Honestly, I don't know what this is. Whether it is just the fields being ruined, someone trying to build an artificial hill, or whichever it is. We can see that the forest area is a bit wider here. But this road here is... If the Russian forces gain control over this square here, this rectangle here, then they will be in a position where they can attack Severna from an area of which the forest line here is much shorter, much thinner than the forest line here to the south. So we'd likely see a strong push by the Russian forces in this direction. But we also see that the village of Severna has this road here that goes through the right side of it, goes through right here. This is going to be one where the Russian forces will have to face a difficult time trying to get through this. The Ukrainian forces have a strong flank here, and they'll have a defensive line here. Together with a defensive line here, combined with the forest areas and the buildings. So all of these together actually add up to... All of these things together add up to the right side being a strong flank for the Ukrainian defenders. Same with the southern parts. That means the weakest part is actually the western part and northern parts. But these are defended by the second village here. So there are these two villages, they defend each other's weaknesses. This one here, the strongest part, is this part here in the south, this forest line here. That is the strongest part, because they have the cover of the forest and they likely have fortifications to the south of it, which haven't been updated by Google Maps. And then they have the strong flank here as well, with the forest lines and likely also defensive dugouts in this direction. So yet again, their weakest area is actually from the western side. So the question here is, will the Russians continue their path from Vodiane here to the south in a northwestern direction, moving in this direction here, to flank the Ukrainian defensive positions here? Or will they focus on the eastern parts? Or will it just go straight ahead, storming them head on? Either way, the clearest option, the most obvious one, is that both of these villages are fairly small. So likely the Russian forces will just heavily bombard them to take advantage of their small size, because no matter how well fortified they are, it ends up being the case that the sizes of them is small nonetheless. So with the FAB 500, FAB 1500s, and now FAB 3000 all being dropped on these positions together with large artillery strikes and so on, the Ukrainian forces will be weakened in their defense. And after a cover of a lot of these bombs, artillery shells, and so on, they'll likely just storm them head on, because rarely any of the flanks are protected in these two villages, as it is kind of like a twin village situation where they both support each other, they both help each other. Going too far on the eastern side will bring them into the crosshair of the citadel area here to the west of Avdiivka. As for the southern area of Avdiivka, before we move on to that, let's take a look at the comments. If I can, here we go. Is the sound still okay? Is everything still okay? How is everything? Make it make sense. The first Tyrannus and Wuladar, why not the other way around? I'm currently looking at the area. I thought Avdiivka is pretty good because that's what the main topic is right now. Later I can go back to Wuladar, Bakhmut, and so on. Yeah, technology is truly amazing. I at this point, I probably think there are some Russian and Ukrainian soldiers sitting in their homes with the VR headset, looking at the data that the army has, and then using that to analyze the situation. Yeah, pre-record is probably a good idea. Maybe if I continue working on all of this, what happened? Yeah, there's countless issues at this point. Like, I don't know what is happening. I definitely need to work a lot more on it. Okay, why did it turn around? Where's Earth? Alright, I'm turning this into a normal stream. Turning this into the Q&A. I need to figure a lot of things out. Give me a second. All right, back at it again. There we go. That is the Q&A community tab. All right. Okay, everything that happened to this point, you can just forget it. I'll fix it out next time, and then we'll go back to the Q&A. All right. This is much easier to deal with. Starting out, let's look at the Q&A thread, and then I'll just go over the questions, and then you can ask questions here. No comment except what casualty figures for both sides do you think are most accurate? The most accurate casualties for both sides. Okay, so first off, we have the case of all right. This guy says, dude, you have a solid following. You're over to us to practice first. All right, let's show you something else then. I'll show you something else. What I just covered, but looking right here. Severity direction. As we can see, this time we actually have the front line. We have the front line right here. If we take a look in this direction, this is our current position. We look in this direction. We see the citadel area. The citadel area is filled with these high-rise buildings. This means that the areas in which the Ukrainian forces have their positions are likely in the higher elevation areas, the higher floors of these buildings, and at the edges of the citadel area. All of these areas, all of these perspectives for the Ukrainian forces allow them to overlook this whole area with their technologies. They can see this whole area here without any obstacles. They have no issues looking at all of this. So when the Russian forces launches their offensive against Severne, against Avdiivka, against the military base here to the south, all of this is directed, and the Ukrainian forces are able to launch direct attacks towards these positions from their positions here in the citadel area. If we also look at Deep State map, we can measure the distance. And if we take a look at the distance between the citadel area and the military base, for example, that's 3.8 kilometers. Towards the areas here to the south of Severne, 3.6 kilometers. Most anti-tank weapons have a range of 5 kilometers, effective range of 5 kilometers. This means that the area in between the citadel area and the Russian forces launching attacks towards Severne is not far enough for them to be safe from the citadel area. Therefore, whenever the Russian forces launch attacks towards Severne, it is very difficult, not just because of the defenses within the villages, but also because of the citadel area. So, this citadel area is the main thorn in the side of the Russian army when it comes to the Battle of Avdiivka. This is also making it the main target for all of the Russian forces in the Avdiivka area. However, we see that the only areas where the Russian forces managed to enter Avdiivka is here in the southeast. This is the area of the industrial zone. They've passed the forest line, they've entered the residential area. So with all of these areas right here in the southeast, we see that the Russian forces continuously push, but it's a very slow grind. But this is the area closest to the citadel area that the Russian forces are present in. The distance we can see right here is 2.6 kilometers. There's 2.6 kilometers from the front line to the citadel area. In the northern direction, there's 6 kilometers. In the eastern direction, there's 4 kilometers, 4.5. So the point is, south, there's 4 kilometers. So the point is, if the Russian forces want to launch attacks towards the citadel area, they would have to go through these open fields, these forest lines, where the Ukrainian forces have direct overview of their movements. The way that they usually do this is going through the night, but the Ukrainians also have night vision gear. This raises the question, how will the Russian forces launch an attack towards the citadel area? Even if they reach it, they have to fight block by block. How will they get supplies? How will they get reinforcements across the open fields to get to the citadel area? The most obvious answer is to go through the city area itself, because although the Ukrainians have direct overview of it, it is very difficult to detect units moving through the buildings. This is why we're seeing the heaviest fighting taking place in the southeast and in the northern parts, because those are the areas in which the citadel area has little to no effect on. So why are we still seeing attacks to the southwest in the direction of Severne and Tonenke? Because the area is currently under Russian control. All the way down here are areas in which the Russian forces can directly strike this road in between the villages to the west of Avdiivka towards Avdiivka itself. So this means that the area to the west of the citadel area, the area which is the main supply route of the citadel area, is under Russian fire control. What about the northern parts? There is this area to the south of the coke plant, which is completely free of any direct fire control of the Russian forces. The only way the Russians can attack this is by artillery or air force. That is why we're seeing a heavy storm in the northern parts. The Russian forces want to take the coke plant. This will completely cut off all supply lines in and out of Avdiivka, taking the coke plant. But to attack the coke plant, the Russian forces have to take a huge risk. and that is that they need to commit a large amount of forces to that area. Therefore, there are two areas the Russian forces need to gain control of before actually getting control of the coke plant. That is the Dacha area to the north of Avdiivka and Stepove. To get control over Stepove, we are seeing that they first started launching attacks directly into the village. That is when the Ukrainian forces counterattacked by launching a direct counterattack, but also attacking the flanks from both sides. Then the Russian forces decided, well, if the Ukrainian forces are going to counterattack from the flanks, then we will just take control of the flanks before taking control of the village. So now we're seeing them take an attack the flanks of Stepove. We look at my map, which is more accurate than Deep State map. Yes, I will say that. The Russian forces have control over both of these forest lines to the north and to the south of Stepove. This means that the next step for the Russian forces is to push further here in the southern flank of Stepove, gain control over this forest line here, take control over Stepove, then they will have full control over it. Then they will launch attacks towards the forest lines here to the north, where we're already seeing that they continue pushing northwards. This is to gain control over the forest lines. One by one, they will take control over the forest lines before finally moving on to Berdishi here from the north. And then they will also continue attacks here to the south, gain further control over the forest lines. And with control over the forest lines down here and fighting over Berdishi in the north, that is the point at which the Russian forces can start storming Avdiivka. Because if we take the look over the area here to the north of the Avdiivsky coke plant, we can see that it is clear Russian forces can already enter the industrial zone here. That is possible. They can walk up, launch an attack, launch an offensive, and storm it. But doing that will leave them weak on the flanks. This is similar to the Battle of Bakhmut, where Prigozhin kept complaining about the flanks, saying that the flanks are weak, they need to send more reinforcements to the flank, they need to improve the flanks, to strengthen their flanks. That is the mistake that the Russian forces are learning from now, strengthening the flanks before they launch attacks. So as soon as Stepove is taken by the Russian forces, which seems more and more likely as time goes by with these small advances which strengthen the Russian positions in the area, then they will storm the Avdiivsky coke plant. There's also the part of the Dacha area here to the east, as Ukrainian forces will be able to launch attacks on the Russian forces here by attacking the flanks again. If they manage to recapture the waste heap, they will have the whole area overlooking Stepove, Krasnodarivka, and so on, and the Russian forces in the whole area would be threatened. So they need a strong flank for the waste heap as well. This is why they have been advancing southwards. So we'll likely see more attacks towards the Dacha areas to try and gain further control over the area, and then they will storm the coke plant. So the coke plant is, when the video comes out, Russian forces storming Avdiivsky coke plant, that is when you need to click on it, because that is when things are going to go fast. The reason I say this is in the Battle of Bakhmut, I actually have this recap map. Let's see if it's this one. Right here. We can see in the northern parts, the Russian forces started storming the industrial zone to the north of Bakhmut on the 14th of March. They got control of the industrial zone on the 26th of March. That's 12 days from the start of the battle to the end of the battle. This was filled with tunnels and so on. Following that, we saw that it was the center of the city being attacked all throughout April and in the western outskirts through May. So if we take that into perspective and add that to Avdiivka, if it takes the Russian forces 2 weeks to gain control over Avdiivsky coke plant, that will also spell the end of all supplies in and out of Avdiivka. At that point, the Russian forces would take just another month or two before they have full control over the area, with the central parts being this one right here, and the western parts being the one right here. And while they storm the coke plant, the Russian forces will also storm the residential areas in the southeast. And if they storm the residential area in the southeast, which we're seeing right now, there are two parts to the southeast of Avdiivka. Actually, three parts. There's this southern part right here, which is the Sarkahotza area, with the trenches all over the southeast, the military base in the southwest, the open areas, and the restaurant area, forest areas, and so on. Then there's the main residential area, which is located on the low grounds, and then there's the forest areas and the high ground residential area. So what the Russian forces are currently doing is that they're pressuring the central part going into the main part, the low ground residential area, and going on the flanks of the southern and northern parts. The southern and northern parts are the more fortified areas, the ones with high concentration of Ukrainian forces, heavy fortifications, all of these things. Comparatively, the low ground area is much weaker, and the Ukrainian forces likely do not have that much fortifications, that much defenses in the area, because it is weaker. Therefore, what the Russians are likely doing is that they're pushing pressure here in the central parts, after which they'll launch attacks on the flanks of the southwestern part by attacking through the south. We've already seen them launch attacks through the bridge and to the restaurant area. So we have seen that they are already capable of launching attacks here in the south. They'll actually continue to do that with a larger force and more conviction. And in the northern parts, you'll likely see attacks towards the water treatment plant here to the east, and then storming the forest line itself from the south and from the east. And likely we'll also see attacks from the north to flank the Ukrainian positions. Especially if they continue here in the central parts, then they can connect with the road here in the north and simply go around the forest area. This will leave the Ukrainian forces in a position where they can attack the supply lines of the Russian forces. But if the Russian forces use heavy bombardments, especially if they can use the TOS systems, that will be their strength to just completely demolish the whole forest area. So this could actually be a legitimate strategy by the Russian forces, pushing through the southern parts here, west of the industrial zone, in the northern area, flanking the Ukrainian positions in the forest area, and simply bombarding the whole forest area with the TOS systems. Because the further away they push the front line, the easier it is for them to bring in the TOS systems within range. The weakness of the TOS system is that the range is low, although the firepower is very heavy. This causes the issue for the Russian forces that essentially, if they put it so close as it being within range of the front line, they are vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery. So these wide edges, like taking control over the area here and area here to the south, will allow the Russian forces to put them further ahead, closer to the front line, and using it without being hit by counter-artillery, because it is very difficult to have artillery by the front line, as they would be exposed to direct fire, motor fire, and other equipment that is low range but more accurate. So with all of this, we can see, okay, if the Russian forces attack the flanks, besides the forest area we have seen that is very difficult to take control of, with the Serbryanki forest area to the south of Kreminna. Fighting has taken place here for over a year, and there's just nothing happening besides a bit back and forth every once in a while. So the forest area is very difficult to go through. If you just burn it all down with a TOS system, that is where you'll see the most success. So likely we'll see the Russian forces going around them, maybe taking the water treatment plant, getting a front line real close, and then bombarding them. Either way, the focus seems to be here to the west of the industrial zone, and we'll likely see some more offensive operations here to the north, as they want to gain control over the fortifications here to the northeast of the city, and getting the front line to a point where they can cover the flanks of the city. So that is pretty much all of the analysis of Avdiivka. Now let's go back to my Q&A page. But before that, let's see what you guys have been saying in the chat. The Citadel needs some more FAB 1500. Yes, the Russian forces do that every day a lot. Thermobaric explosions make everything better if you are the one shooting them, yes. Russian Ministry of Defense should learn from Israel on how to deal with fortified urban areas. If they are completely rid of civilians, then yes, you should bombard them until they don't exist. That is the general military consensus. The reason why the Russians aren't doing it, I don't know. FAB 500 in Avdiivka, there's been a lot. FAB 500 to persuade. let's see if there are any questions. What is the distance between the Russian troops and the crab claw that is closing around Avdiivka? So the distance between these two areas, we have to take a look at this one because my map doesn't allow to measure distance unless I put it on edit actually. Then it will allow me to. Right there. The closest area directly is 5.6 kilometers. But that's not how it will happen. If they were to close it, it would be... Actually, they would take control over the industrial zone and they would likely push here. I don't think they will ever try to actually close this. The most logical part is similar to Bakhmut, where they would take control over the coke plant, and even just holding the positions as they are here to the south allows direct fire towards this road between the Citadel area and Shevardina. This would leave 0 supply routes for Ukraine in and out of Avdiivka. So that's likely what is going to happen, rather than a full closure, full encirclement of the city. Why is Russia winning lately, Weep Union? From a non-expert perspective, I only see a couple square kilometers movement on the front line. Maybe Ukraine only has the front line and if it's broken, everything falls. That's the thing. It is reported that the Ukrainian forces, their fortifications are built around the front line. Not even everywhere in the front line. Zaporizhia hardly has anything. The strongest fortifications the Ukrainians have is within Donetsk. And if we take a look at Donetsk, we can see that the areas they have is the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line. They have fortifications all throughout the front line, from Uledar, Velika Novosilka, area which was previously Marinka, Avdiivka itself, heavily fortified city, New York, yes, it's called New York, Toretsk, Jazov Yar. This whole area is all heavily fortified. But beyond that, there's this final city line here that goes from Pokrovsk and up to Oleksandrivka. But beyond this, there's no heavy fortifications. Every fortifications that is built beyond this whole area is built in a couple of months. It's ragtag fortifications. It's nothing serious. This is why if the Russian forces gets a breakthrough somewhere on the front line, then they are able to completely change the form of fighting we are currently seeing. Because all the fighting we are seeing is, if we zoom in, we can see these fortifications right here. Heavily fortified trenches, dugouts everywhere. These are all the positions that the Russians are fighting through. We can see right here, heavily fortified trench area with dugouts, with trenches, the military base here to the south, trenches, dugouts. If we go to the south of Avdiivka, trenches, dugouts, the same everywhere. That is the same all throughout the front line, especially in the Donetsk region. This is why, although we only see small advances, for example in Klishivka, we saw these small advances. These small advances were in the direction of this fortified area to the north of the village. They had to go through the forest lines, they have to go through the trenches, they have to go through the fortifications, all while under shelling of the Ukrainian forces. So yes, it is only approximately 3 square kilometers or whatever it is of advancements, but this is a huge trench area, all while Klishivka itself is fully populated with Ukrainian soldiers. We also see the fortification here to the west of Klishivka. So they're fighting at fortified areas. In the area right here, although we cannot see it on the satellite images, a rough draw of the trenches we see in the area is that there are multiple lines, they are interconnected, and they are heavily fortified all throughout this whole area. Having to fight through those trenches, those trench lines, these fortifications is very difficult. However, they have none of that in the back line outside of the Donetsk region. The Donetsk region is so heavily fortified because of the Ukrainian civil war, where there was a very long ceasefire, and everyone was preparing for when that ceasefire ends, the fighting continues. They built all of these fortifications, but now we're seeing this war, and these fortifications were not built for naught. They were definitely a heavy impact. In the direction of Novomikhailivka, These are areas where there are less fortifications than other parts, but it's still within the Donetsk region. They still had a lot of focus in this area. There was not a lot of movement in this direction for a long time. This allowed the Ukrainians to build fortifications. The reason why there's not a lot of fortifications behind the front line is because the Ukrainians were planning for a breakthrough. They were planning on advances. The areas that aren't by the front line are less fortified. The northern area, the northern border between Belarus and Ukraine, is heavily fortified because the Ukrainians wanted to avoid any Russian assault from Belarus to cut off the supply lines between Ukraine and the west. So they built kilometers wide, a lot of kilometers wide minefields all throughout the forest areas here to the north. I'm not exactly sure how much, but it is a lot. They had thousands, tens of thousands of soldiers to build trenches and minefields and fortifications here in the north between Belarus and Ukraine. However, and it is the same with Kharkiv, the same with Sumy, same with Chernihiv, this whole northern and eastern border is heavily fortified because the Ukrainians from day one of the offensive, as soon as the Russian forces were pulled out of Kiev, as soon as they pulled out of Kharkiv, they started heavily investing on the fortifications. However, in Dnipro, in Poltava, in Cherkasy, in Kiev, the southern parts, all of this inside area is hardly fortified. There's been no effort put into fortifying these areas, as far as I know, as far as open source tells you. This whole area is completely vulnerable compared to anywhere else on the front. And in the end, the Ukrainian army is heavily focused in the south, the same with the Russian. The Russians, according to Putin, has 617,000 soldiers in the south. The Ukrainian forces, there's no official number on how many soldiers they have in the south, but it is the vast majority of the forces, about 80% at least, of the Ukrainian armies in the south. So the reason why we see people questioning, will they open a new front? That is because we get these numbers from the Russian army, from Russian officials, that they had 400,000 new volunteers, they mobilized 300,000, they had the initial army, they have other units, they have volunteers from the first year. All of these add up to maybe 1 million. So if the Russian forces, or even the official number from Russian officials is that the Russian army consists of 1.3 million soldiers. If they have 1.3 million soldiers and they have 600,000 in the south, where's the rest of the 700,000? Most of them are not committed to the conflict. If we say 500,000 are conscripts, that only leaves 200,000 without anything to do. They are likely just on rotation. So basically the whole Russian army is in the south. That is why we're not seeing any new front being opened. In the scenario where Russian forces took all of the forces on rotation, put them near Belgorod, near Kursk, and then opened a new front, in that scenario, the Russians would have a vast numerical superiority. So although there are fortifications by the front line, if they aren't properly manned, to have more than if the Russians attack with a 3-1 advantage, that would be a decent attack, decent numerical superiority, but they'll still be threatened by these fortifications. If it was 5-1 or 10-1, then the Ukrainian defenders would have a very hard time holding them back, especially since the Russian forces could launch an attack with half of the forces they concentrated. But all of this is hypothetical, and in the end, what we're seeing is that if the Russians started concentrating their forces here in Kursk, then Western satellites will take images, they'll detect the concentration of forces. The Ukrainians will relocate forces to Sumy, they will relocate to Kharkiv to deal with this before it happens. But then again, that would weaken the front line for the Ukrainians. So the Russians still have an interest in building up forces around the whole front line just to have some. This is why we're seeing this constant threat from Belarus being a huge thorn in the side of Ukraine, because they don't believe Belarus would start invading Ukraine, as Belarus has not done it yet. But there's still the risk that they will, especially if Wagner is present there, which they still are. They're still training Ukrainian soldiers. So is the Russian army. They're also training not Ukrainian, Belarusian soldiers in Belarus. So there's still a constant threat from Belarus. There's also the conscripts of the Russian army all throughout Kursk, Belgorod, the border areas, border guards, conscripts, training centers, military bases. So there's a constant threat towards Ukraine, but they're leaving the bare minimum to defend. This is because we see that the vast majority of the Russian army is in the south. So this raises the question, if the majority of the Russian army is in the south, yet they're just barely dealing with what is happening in the south, this raises the question, how effective is the Russian army, how effective is the Ukrainian army, and so on. The reason why the Ukrainian army is able to deal with this massive Russian army in the south is because of their fortifications. So let's say 40,000 Ukrainians in Avdiivka could deal with 100,000 Russian soldiers. Well, what if Avdiivka falls and they have to defend in areas like these small villages? Then it will turn from 40,000 to 80,000 to deal with 100,000. And further on, outside of the Donetsk region, it will be 100,000 to 100,000 to deal with the Russian forces. So the more fortified areas the Russians get rid of, first it was Bakhmut, now it's Avdiivka, the less forces the Russians need to concentrate in the south to deal with the Ukrainian forces. So the idea for the Russian forces here is to weaken the Ukrainian positions as much as possible, so they have to concentrate more and more forces in the south while still conquering their objectives, which is the Donetsk region, which is their main objective. It was from the very start one of the requests, one of the ideas they had, one of the conditions of peace for Russia was that Donetsk was fully under Donetsk DPR control. And as such, we see that there's a lot of efforts. The concentration of fighting is happening here by Novomikhailivka, Marinka, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Siversk, Kreminna. All of this is in the Donetsk region. So with all of this, we see that the focus of the Russian forces is the Donetsk region. So as a whole, on the whole front line, concentrating forces and dealing with Donetsk first is the most difficult part of the front line. This is the hardest part for the Russians to deal with. This is the most difficult part to fight in for the Russian forces. Yet they still choose to do so because they see it as living up to the goals they initially had, but at the same time also having the Ukrainian forces being worn down. Currently, how many Ukrainian soldiers are on rotation compared to Russian soldiers? If we assume that the 200,000 missing Russian soldiers are casualties, then basically all the Russian soldiers are on the front line. If we assume that they are on rotation, then we know, well, the Russian forces are not dealing do not have a lot of leg room. They're putting everything they have to deal with the current situation. But either way, 617,000 tells us a lot about the situation at the front line. So you asked, we only see these small advances by the Russian forces on the front line. Why is everyone in the Western media panicking over that? The main reason is that in the Battle of Avdiivka, it is reported that 40,000 Russian soldiers are taking place. In the Battle of Marinka, it was about 10,000. In the Battle of Bakhmut, let's say 80,000. That's 130,000. Then we still have 480,000 left. That is the thing. If the Russian forces have 100,000 here in Zaporizhia, 100,000 here in the whole Kherson region, that's 200,000. Let's say 100,000 between Huliaipole all the way to Avdiivka, and then another 100,000 here all the way to Bakhmut. Then we know it was previously reported 110,000 in the north. That is 100, 200, 300, 400, 510. We're missing 100,000. Is this forces in reserve behind the front line, waiting for a breakthrough so that they can take advantage of it, launch a armored assault? Is it spread across the whole front, a division on each side to do so? Is it all concentrated in one area? Are they preparing to open a new front? The amount of soldiers in each part of the front line is a very important fact that we cannot find out because we do not have the necessary technology to do so. If you watch some of the PR videos and photos from the command and control part of the war, we can see that the maps that they have, unlike mine, which is just Ukraine, Russia, where's the fighting taking place, who controlled what, so on. They have units, they have terrain, they have so many things that they can use to analyze the situation. For every 1,000 things a military analyst has on the front line, I have one thing to deal with, to analyze. So it makes it much more difficult to assess the situation and to get any idea of what is going to happen. But what I know is happening, and what I see the situation is, and why I see Western experts panicking over the current situation, is that the fighting is very heavy. The Ukrainians just dealt with 6 months of their own offensive, which failed. And it failed because we can very clearly see they captured Robotyne, and that's it. They didn't take Tokmak, they didn't go down to Berdyansk, they didn't cross over and take control over the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. Instead, they just made a small dent on the front line. After all of this 6 months long offensive operation, the Russians are now starting their own. They captured all of Marinka, they're pressuring Novomikhailivka, they almost have Avdiivka in the full operational encirclement. They push west of Bakhmut, they push in the direction of Kreminna, they also focus forces in the direction of Kupiansk. All of this, plus the 6 months of offensive, is a lot of attrition. The Ukrainians have to deal with that. They have to replace lost soldiers, they have to replace lost equipment. Yet if we look at the Western support, the Western equipment sent to Ukraine, how much is actually there? How much is being sent from June to today? In total, less than $10 billion, where between February 24th, 2022 and June 1st, 2023, it was over $100 billion. So in half the time, they got a tenth of the support, which mainly consisted of just ammunition. If you Leopard 1s, that is nothing in comparison to Leopard 2s, Abrams, Challenger tanks. There's also the point of, well, they're sending F-16 fighter jets. They haven't received any of them yet. And what does F-16, how does F-16 replace Leopard 2s? How does F-16 replace Javelins? They need more of everything, but they're receiving hardly any. It has already been confirmed. It is delayed. The European Union and the United States are delaying the final negotiations until after Christmas, into January. Then it will be exactly 6 months since the Ukrainians last received these parts of equipment. Last time, the Ukrainians were promised tanks. They were promised all of these things in December/January. They received them, or like some of them they received early in February and March. Others they received in May. It can take half a year for them to receive some of the equipment they were promised. We also see delays in the F-16s that were promised. They're delayed. Training takes longer. Refurbishing takes longer. So many things. So even if tomorrow both the EU and the United States promise a lot of aid to Ukraine, how long will it actually take for that aid to reach the front line? All of this, while the Ukrainians have to deal with 617,000 Russian soldiers. Some people, some analysts, Western analysts, not me, Western analysts, say Ukraine will not survive until summer if the aid stops now. That is how dire the situation is. That is how much they're losing compared to what they're receiving. Ukraine is not producing anything, no matter how much Zelensky tells you that Ukraine is going to be self-sufficient in military technology. Currently, all of their fabrics, all of their industrial areas are completely bombarded by Russian long-range missile strikes. Whenever they detect a factory, they bombard it. Whenever they detect an airfield, they bombard it. We see in-depth Lancet strikes. We see cruise missiles. We see all of these things hitting the industrial base of the Ukrainians. They cannot even repair their tanks in Ukraine. They need to send them to Poland. So all of this, if you combine all of this, you can see that the situation is dire, not because the front line is moving a couple of kilometers, but because of the losses suffered for those 5 kilometers. The main strategy difference between the Russians and Ukrainians on defense in this war is that whenever the Ukrainians have launched attacks, we see that the Russian forces instead of holding their positions, tend to withdraw and allow the artillery to deal with the Ukrainian forces. In comparison, when the Russian forces attack, the Ukrainians fight over every single forest line. We can see it, it is clear. This is not because the Russians only are able to walk a couple of kilometers every time they launch an offensive. It is because the Ukrainians fight for every single square meter. They fight for every single forest. They fight for every single tree. They fight for every single trench. That is the difference. The Russian strategy causes less casualties for both sides, while the Ukrainian strategy causes more casualties for both sides. How many exactly? I can never tell you because I don't have the information. I do not have the necessary information to tell you how many casualties each side has. But I can tell you something for sure. That is, when the Russians are on the offensive, there are more casualties than when the Ukrainians are on the offensive. And as such, we see that the end of the Ukrainian offensive and the start of the Russian one, is a major cause of concern for anyone who supports Ukraine, especially when Western support is dwindling and slowing down and not sincere. Because no one who is sincere will delay this as much as it has been delayed. So with this, we see that the situation is terrible for Ukraine. It is very difficult for Ukraine, and it will continue to grow difficult, more and more difficult, the longer they have to wait for additional supplies. Because at some point, whether it is a loss of equipment or loss of manpower, if the Ukrainians continue as is, being heavily reliant on the West, and the West just delaying their support, it will eventually break the Ukrainian army. At some point, whether it is lack of manpower or lack of equipment, the Ukrainians will not be able to cover the whole front line. It's a very wide front line with artillery strikes, artillery duels, air strikes, missile strikes every day, all day for both sides. But the Russians produce their own, the Ukrainians rely on the West. That is the difference. If Russians capture Avdiivka, will they be able to start using Donetsk airport again? No. If the Russians want to use Donetsk airport, it will take some time to fix it, first of all. But even if they fix it, they need at the very least 30 kilometers of range between it and the front line. So they'll need to have the fights go out around Pokrovsk area if they want to use the airfield. However, to be 100% sure, it needs to be about 50 kilometers, because at that point, if HIMARS wanted to strike and so on, they'll still be able to be 1000% sure, 200 kilometers. It wants to be even surer beyond the range of the drones. They need to be fighting Paris. That is the point. You can never be 100% sure, because in the end, the intercontinental ballistic missiles of the United States have tens of thousands of kilometers of range. So if they want to use it again, they need at least 30 kilometers of distance to avoid artillery strikes. That is very easy to launch. 30 kilometers is the main idea. Beyond that, you can only become more and more safe. The point is, Donetsk airport, 30 kilometers. Before that, it's not even being repaired. There are reports of Ukrainian abandoning northern Klishchivka. Do you think Klishchivka will fall once again, and when? Since the Russian forces captured the fortified area, yes, Klishchivka is going to fall. There's no Klishchivka without this fortified area. If the Ukrainians want to hold on to Klishchivka, they need to recapture it. Until then, it is destined to fall. There are reports, yes, of the Ukrainians losing the high grounds here to the southeast of Klishchivka, as well as the northern parts of the village. This is very reasonable, as Russians now have the high ground here in the northwest, fortified areas, allowing them to directly fire into Ukrainian positions. Therefore, it makes it obvious that the Ukrainians would withdraw from these positions, so that the front line would look a bit more like this. You'll have the fortified area here. You'll also likely be pushed back from Andriivka area, as these are all open fields. They would be vulnerable to Russian forces, and then eventually they would have to either recapture the fortified areas or completely withdraw. Otherwise, the Russian forces will simply just encircle them from pushing here in the western direction from the fortified areas. The main difference between this and any other war that I've really read about in history is that both sides seems to be very scared of launching attacks, because what we have available, the Russian soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers, how many soldiers they have available, how much equipment they have available, is much less than what is actually needed in a real war. The reason for this is that war has become too smart. Making smart tanks, making smart jets, making smart drones, all of this requires a lot more money, a lot more equipment, a lot more sophistication than stupid weapons. In World War II, there were very advanced tanks, there were decent tanks. The very advanced tanks, they were very powerful, very strong, very efficient, but it didn't really matter that much because in the end, they were very difficult to make. They were very expensive to make. They required a lot of equipment. They required a lot of materials. So the dumb tanks, the weaker tanks, were mass produced, while these more advanced tanks were put for special forces, for advanced units, but they were small in numbers. This is similar to what we see today. However, it seems that both sides are not making a lot of these dumb units, because the weakest tank we see today is $1 million. Compared to that, a $20,000 drone can demolish that to a $1 million tank. So the only thing that is being mass produced today is manpads, ATGM, man-held ATGMs, and drones. Those are the ones being mass produced because they can make thousands of drones, they can make thousands of javelins, they can make thousands of manpads. They can make all of this. Compared to that, making thousands of tanks is much more difficult, much more time consuming. It is reported that in 2023, the Russians made about 200 T-90Ms. Compared to that, they made like 20,000 drones, FPV drones. So yes, there you have it, 100 to 1. Every one tank, there's 100 drones. If you need 10 drones to destroy a tank, you destroy 10 tanks with the time it takes to make one tank. It is not worth it to make tanks then. So this is why we have seen that the war has turned from tank assaults to really just drone assaults. So the real question is, when will the armies be able to launch a massive drone strike with thousands of drones launching everywhere, hitting all the frontline positions? Because at that time, that is when we'll see the frontline moving again. Because if all of the fortified positions of either side is demolished by a massive drone strike, then in the end, what is to hold back the armored assaults from launching and succeeding? Okay, the minefields. If all of the artillery is hit by drones, if all of the fortified positions are hit by drones, then mine-clearing equipment, mine-clearing vehicles will have a much easier time clearing the mines without getting hit by artillery. So the difference between what we're seeing now, the Battle of Attrition, and the return of Blitzkrieg or speed-based warfare is going to be drones. That is almost guaranteed at this point, unless some new technology allows tanks to just drive over mines or survive 10 artillery shots. Then we may see the tanks being useful again. But at this point, everyone is placing their bets on drones. We're seeing the Russians produce much more drones than what the West is sending, especially since Russia has a much easier time receiving drones from China than the West has, and China can just mass produce beyond anything the combined West can do. And the Russians themselves also are able to produce with software help from China. As such, we see that the Russians are completely outproducing the West. We also see the Lancets, the Shahed drones. All of these are much better than what the West can send to Ukraine when it comes to these small, cheap drones. The more advanced, expensive ones, the West has better of. But in the end, those are not the ones that make a difference in this war. Also, of course, it has a huge impact. It's still, especially the UAVs, the unmanned aerial vehicles that are reconnaissance based. They fly around the Black Sea, gives all of the information to the Ukrainians that they need to conduct their Crimea operations, Kherson operations, and even to detect what happens at the front line. Also in the Baltics to check if the Russians are building up forces in the north. All of this constantly helping the Ukrainians. The Russians do not have the same capabilities the United States has in that regard, But what they do have is the small ones at the front line having an impact there. German drones as well, hitting the back line of Ukraine, accurately hitting locations that are much more difficult to hit as they are moving with the missiles. The smaller targets, not the big ones. So all of this together helps Russia a lot, and the Ukrainians are very struggling to keep up. The Chinese economy may also collapse soon. Russia cannot make too many drones without China. Honestly, at this point, whenever I look at the economy, I think everything is going to collapse. Whether the West, China, Russia, all of it is very unhealthy. Housing market is completely... it's crazy, man. The economy is crazy. It's print more money, and suddenly there's no consequences. 10% inflation is not consequences for the amount of money they're printing. The loan is not getting paid back. The United States has how much in debt? US debt, GDP. 123% of the GDP is debt. Like, how much are they paying just to continue that debt, much less pay it back in interest? So actually, it is actually a huge chunk of the US federal budget being spent on interest on their loans. Like, for example, how are they even coping? It makes no sense. This is why the West, the wealth inequality and just general issues. Housing market. How many houses have you seen that is like a shed, just a random shed, 50 square feet for 100K in Los Angeles, something like that? Like, it's crazy. In Denmark, it is a bit cheaper because we have a small population. It is also a small country, but it's still a small population. There's a lot of affordable housing, but being able to take a loan. Let me explain to you quickly how taking a loan is bad for the economy. The reason for that is, let's say we have a house. That house is worth $1 million. It's the $1 million house. Someone who's making 100K a year wants to buy that house. The bank tells him, you're making 100K a year, I'll allow it. I'll loan you $1 million, and then you'll pay it back with interest. The guy who makes 100K a year agrees. In 30 years, he will pay it back. The interest is just 1%. Everyone looks at the interest, 1%. That is great, that is amazing. I only have to pay, what is 1% of $1 million? That is $10,000. He has to pay $10,000 every year extra in interest. In 30 years, that's 300K. So that $1 million house becomes a $1.3 million house. That is how interest loans is hurting the economy. It is inflating the price of items because people take loans to buy stuff, then the value of the stuff increases. Because what are people selling stuff for? They sell it for the highest possible amount of money they can get from the service or item they're providing. Because that is the basics of economists. They want to make as much money as possible. That is economy. So if someone sells something, realizing that if I sell it for more, people will still buy it because they'll just take a loan, then the prices rise. And at the same time, houses are being limited. You cannot build as many houses as you could in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, you'll find an empty plot of land, you'll build a house. Feudalism, you need to get permission from the local lord. He technically always gives permission because he can take taxes from you. Denmark today, if you want to get permission, you have a time limit. You have to make up a plan. You have to pay people to give you a license. You have to do this, that, and that. And it's so much more difficult. Of course, the quality significantly rises, but the amount of bureaucracy you have to go through makes it, instead of building the exact same house for $1 million, you would pay $2 million just because of the bureaucracy, because of the administration, because of the licenses, all of these things. So the more services there are, the more expensive things become. Yes, the quality follows, but not as much as money is being produced. Europe today is in a huge issue. Why? Because the industrial capacity of the continent has significantly decreased because it's gone from a product-based, industrial-based economy to a service-based economy. You can get every form of service in Europe, every single form. But how much is actually produced, how many products are produced in Europe, they are all imported from India, from China, from any East Asian country that has cheap labor costs. Then you sit there like, okay, if world trade stops, for example, the Houthis stopped the Red Sea stuff. Now Maersk, for example, Danish shipping company, the second biggest in the world, is not sailing through the Red Sea. They stopped after one of their ships were taken down. Now they have to go around Africa. This significantly delays a lot of items for weeks, if not months. So instead of sailing through the Red Sea, let's see, someone ordered something from China, goes through straight Singapore, south of India, towards Yemen, through Egypt, Suez Canal, goes to Italy. There you go. Now instead it has to go to the south of Africa. And as you can see, this is a huge issue. It's much easier for China because they don't, the United States, because they don't even care. It is sent across the ocean. There you go. You got it. But for Europe, this is a huge issue. What if someday Egypt denies crossing through the Suez Canal? What if South Africa becomes a piracy country that just catches all of the ships going through the south? The whole world-based order is based on the United States protecting shipments. If they don't, then the whole world-based order collapses. This is why, if you haven't seen this, breaking news, breaking news, United States launch Operation, what's it called? Defending Prosperity, I believe, against Yemen. I don't remember what it's called, but basically the United States has announced that it will launch an operation against the Houthis to defend the ships. They're basically going to war with the Houthis. Whoa, suddenly we have a war against Yemen, between the United States and Yemen. Why? Because Yemen got angry at Israel because what they're doing in Gaza. If war comes to the Red Sea region, wow, suddenly a huge escalation. Surjati Narayan Giri, Weep, answer me. What have you said? You said, Weep, please talk. Weep, please tell how the war in Ukraine will end. Tell us all scenarios. All right. Let's think of magical scenarios for how the Ukrainian war will end. Let's just make it simple. Let's pick 3 scenarios and go through these 3 scenarios. Change the title to 3 scenarios for the end of the Ukraine war. Let's see if we'll get more viewers now. We have hit a top of 2041 viewers. Thank you everyone for joining the stream. This is pretty cool. Thank you all. It's pretty cool having 20,041. It's more than the year we're in. How do you think there will be an agreement in 2024 or war till uncon? Okay, let's see. 3 scenarios. Let's go through 3 scenarios. Scenario number 1. The most positive possible end scenario for Ukraine. This is what I can think of being the very best, 100% best possible. Everything else beyond this is impossible in my eyes. The best possible end for Ukraine is that, first of all, they agree to Russia's demand. They admit neutrality. They will not be a part of NATO. They may be a part of the EU, but they will not be a part of NATO. They will not allow NATO bases, NATO deployment, and so on inside Ukraine. Number 2, they return Zaporizhia and Kherson. Both of these regions return to Ukraine. Donetsk and Luhansk is lost. Crimea is lost, and they have to recognize it as Russian territory. That is the best possible scenario for Ukraine. That is the best possible outcome at this point, at the current time. Because everything else points to it being much worse than that for the Ukrainians right now. So that is, in my opinion, the best possible scenario for the end of the war for Ukraine. Now, as for a neutral outcome, that is just a ceasefire around the front line. The current situation is just frozen. That is the second scenario. The third scenario is the most possible, not the most possible, the most positive possible scenario. This is possible, and it is the most positive that is still possible for the Russian outcome. I'm not saying that it is likely what is going to happen. I say it is possible that this is going to happen. And that is that the Russians take full control over Ukraine. In the sense that Russia takes everything they want. The likely scenario of what they want is something along Kharkiv, Poltava, Kremenchuk, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Kryvyi Rih, Mykolaiv, Odessa. They do not want anything more than this. And then they leave the rest in exchange for a limit on the size of the Ukrainian army, neutrality, and economic cooperation, stuff like that. Basically having Ukraine as a puppet state while controlling the areas they want to control. That is the most positive that is still possible to happen for the Russians. So those are the 3 scenarios for the end of the Ukraine war. By the way, this stream, when it ends, it'll become unlisted. The reason for that is I have a special feature. That feature is streams that I end is not archived except for Patreon members who are of the 3rd tier. So if you want to see the archives of all my streams, including that where I analyze Valery Gerasimov's strategy for defense, you have to go on my Patreon and subscribe on my 3rd tier. I also upload videos, as you can see here. My full front update on the 5th of December, 12 days ago. I added a few extra minutes where I talk my full feelings, my honest feelings. That is probably not suitable for YouTube. Don't want to endanger my position on YouTube. I have this analysis on the 11th of November about increasing world tensions. I have this one, recap and prediction of October. Polish volunteer reveals truth, where I talk about an article where Polish volunteer talks. 100 soldiers hold back multiple thousands for 2 weeks. I did an analysis of Ukraine's offensive on the 14th of August. Casualties of the war in Ukraine. I did an analysis of how many casualties each side has. So I'm doing a few of these videos. I want to increase what I do, make it more special to be a member. But that is in my to-do list, because honestly at this point I'm just sitting here. I spent half of the day today just figuring out what am I even going to make a video about today. Then I decided to do this live stream, maybe a video later. Maybe I can do highlights of this stream. I'll find that out later. But that is going to be all for this one. What about your Atarehi video that you did with him? It should still be up. There should not be anything wrong with it. It should be on my page, if you can find it. But that's going to be all for this one. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.